The corridor is narrow. The air hasn't moved in months. A man works at the stone with a chisel, steady, unhurried, taking his time. The name beneath his tool has been there for 30 years, carved by skilled hands, blessed by priests, built to last forever. By nightfall, it will be gone. In the belief system of ancient Egypt, a name was not simply a word. It was the part of a person that survived the body, the piece of identity that allowed a soul to continue existing beyond death. Cutting a name from stone was not an act of destruction. It was an execution, delivered a generation after the burial. The man who ordered it had spent his entire life serving 4 pharaohs. Then he erased them, all 4, and took the throne for himself. I've been sitting with Horemheb for a long time. He's the kind of figure that changes shape the longer you look at him. Not a conqueror, not a rebel. A man who waited, who served, and outlasted, and understood exactly when to move. This channel is for people who are done with surface-level history. If that's you, subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. To understand what Horemheb did, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Not the world of chaos and erasure. That comes later. The world before all of that. Egypt at the height of its power in the reign of Amenhotep III, sometime around 1380 BCE. A civilization so wealthy, so deeply ordered, and so convinced of its own permanence that the idea of its collapse would have seemed not merely unlikely, but cosmologically impossible. The empire stretched from the upper reaches of the Euphrates down through Canaan, across the Sinai, and deep into Nubian territory to the south. Tribute arrived from every direction: gold from the Nubian mines, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, passing through a dozen hands before it reached Egyptian workshops. The diplomatic correspondence that survives from this period, the archive we now call the Amarna letters, clay tablets found in the ruins of a later capital, shows the king of Egypt exchanging gifts with the rulers of Babylon, Mitanni, and Azawa, addressing them when he was in a generous mood as brothers. Though the Egyptian texts would never quite say that. Equals were not something the Egyptian worldview had a clean category for. The palace complex at Malkata on the west bank of Thebes was under construction. Amenhotep III's builders were in the process of excavating an artificial lake, roughly 2 kilometers long, adjacent to the palace for his queen, Ti. Not a canal, not a reservoir. A lake dug by hand, completed in 15 days according to his own inscriptions, a timeline that scholars have spent considerable energy either explaining or politely questioning. This was the world. Into it, somewhere in the region of Heracleopolis, a provincial city in Middle Egypt known to the ancient Egyptians as Henan-Nesut. A boy was born to a family the historical record has never bothered to name. We don't know his father's profession. We don't know his mother's name. The archive preserves nothing of his early life because, at the time of his early life, he was nobody. A provincial boy in a civilization built to ensure that the vast majority of provincial boys remained exactly that. What we know is that he was educated. The Egyptian military and Horemheb almost certainly entered the military system young, probably through one of the regional schools that trained officers and scribes simultaneously, required literacy, administrative competence, the ability to read and draft official documents, to manage supply logistics, to communicate across the hierarchical layers of a standing army embedded in a massive bureaucratic state. For a boy of ambition without royal blood, the army was not the only path upward, but it was one of the most direct. The priesthood offered another route, the civil administration another still. The military offered proximity to the king's person, to campaigns, to the kind of visibility that civilian careers rarely generated as quickly, and he was good at it. That much the later record makes clear, even when it's making claims we have to read carefully. By the time Horemheb becomes fully visible in the surviving sources, which is not until well into adulthood, he bears titles that no man accumulates by accident. Meanwhile, in the palace at Malkata, something else was forming. Amenhotep. The third's health was beginning to fail. He had reigned for nearly 4 decades, long enough that an entire generation had grown up knowing no other king, no other rhythm of state. His son, the crown prince, who would eventually call himself Akhenaten, was already showing signs of the religious preoccupation that courtiers close to the family must have been watching with varying degrees of unease. The priesthood of Amun, headquartered at the great temple complex of Karnak, had spent centuries accumulating institutional power alongside the palace rather than beneath it. Their landholdings were vast, their workshops processed tribute, their administrative structures rivaled the palace's own. The relationship between Amun's priests and the royal family had always been one of mutual dependence dressed as devotion. It had worked more or less for generations. The crown prince was about to make it not work, but that was still ahead. In the world of Amenhotep III's late reign, none of this was visible from the training grounds of Heracleopolis or the administrative offices where a young officer from a provincial family was learning the grammar of power. What was visible was order, deep, ancient, apparently unshakable order. A civilization that had been running the same basic operating system for over 1,000 years, maintained by a class of scribes and priests who understood their function as something closer to maintenance than governance. Keeping a machine turning that had always turned would always turn because the gods themselves had designed it that way. In their understanding of how the world worked, the pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the functional hinge between the human and divine orders, the being through whom cosmic stability, which they called Ma'at, was channeled into the physical world. When the pharaoh performed rituals, made offerings, conducted wars, and administered justice, he was not doing political work. He was doing cosmological work, keeping reality from coming apart. The entire machinery of the Egyptian state, the temples, the granaries, the military, the tax collectors, the scribes, existed in service of this single structural claim. Horemheb would have been educated in this worldview from the moment he learned to read. It was the water he swam in. And yet, and this is where it gets interesting if you spend enough time with the record, what the sources eventually show us is a man who understood that worldview at a depth that included its mechanics. Not just what the system claimed to be, what it actually was, how it ran, where the weight sat, which parts of the structure could be moved, which could be replaced, and which had to be preserved because too many people's sense of reality depended on them. 20 years of military service in the most powerful empire on earth will teach a careful observer certain things about power that no priest ever puts in writing. He was learning, he was watching, and the storm was still a decade away. Amenhotep IV became pharaoh around 1353 BCE. Within 5 years, he had done something no living Egyptian had a framework for understanding. He had declared the entire accumulated theology of their civilization obsolete. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun, not a god with a human body or a myth cycle or a family, but simply the light itself, the physical fact of solar energy, was elevated above Amun, above Ra, above Osiris, above the entire pantheon that had structured Egyptian religious life for centuries. The pharaoh changed his name. Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. The temples of Amun were closed, their estates were seized by the crown. The priesthood that had spent generations building its institutional parallel to the palace was disbanded, stripped of its income, scattered. Akhenaten founded a new capital city on virgin ground in Middle Egypt, a site that had no previous religious associations, no existing temples, no accumulated claims by any priesthood, and named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. We know it today as Amarna. It was built from nothing in roughly 4 years, which tells you something about what Egyptian labor organization was capable of when the state decided something needed to exist immediately. The Aten did not speak through priests. It did not deliver oracles. It did not have a mythology the way Osiris had a mythology. No death, no resurrection, no weighing of hearts, no elaborate funerary technology to manage the passage between worlds. In the theological system Akhenaten was constructing, the Aten communicated with the world through exactly one intermediary, the pharaoh himself, which meant that the entire religious apparatus that had, for centuries, required a vast professional priesthood to operate, the rituals, the festivals, the offerings, the management of divine estates, now required only Akhenaten. He had not merely changed the religion, he had nationalized it, and he had placed himself, alone, at the point of contact between the human world and whatever force governed it. For a career military officer in the middle ranks of the Egyptian army, this was not an abstract theological development to observe from a comfortable distance. The military's ceremonial life was deeply embedded in the old religious structure. Battle victories were dedicated to Amun, the god whose power was believed to travel with Egyptian armies, whose blessing legitimized conquest, whose temples received a portion of the spoils. Military appointments often carried religious dimensions. The great festivals that punctuated the Egyptian calendar, the Opet festival at Karnak, the beautiful Feast of the Valley, involved military contingents as participants and guards. The administrative infrastructure binding the army together had been woven for generations into the same institutional fabric as the Amun priesthood. Pull one thread and the whole system shifted. What Akhenaten pulled was not one thread, and the disruption was not sudden or spectacular. That's the part that gets lost when this period is dramatized. There was no single day of collapse. The change was institutional and grinding, a slow erosion of the bureaucratic routines that held things together, the replacement of familiar hierarchies with improvised ones, the confusion of officials who had spent their careers navigating a system that no longer existed in its original form. Supply lines changed, ceremonial protocols changed. Men who had built their authority within the old structure found that the new structure was being invented from the top down, and that no one had asked them to participate in the invention. Here is where I have to be honest about what the record does and doesn't tell us. I've spent more time than I should probably admit looking for Horemheb in the Amarna documents, the administrative records, the private correspondence, the boundary stele, the tomb inscriptions from the city of Akhetaten itself, where officials loyal to the new regime built elaborate tombs describing their proximity to the royal family and their devotion to the Aten. He is not there, not as a name, not as a title, not as the recipient of royal favor, which was the currency Amarna officials collected and displayed with considerable energy. For a man who was, within a decade of Akhenaten's death, one of the two most powerful figures in the Egyptian state, his absence from the Amarna record is, and I want to be careful here, because silence in an ancient archive can mean many things, conspicuous. The straightforward reading is that he was not at Amarna. But whether that means he was stationed in the field, serving in Nubia or the Levant, quietly administering military affairs at Memphis, or deliberately keeping distance from a regime he judged with the clarity of a man who planned to outlast it, the sources do not say. I can tell you what I think. I cannot tell you what happened. What was happening at the borders in the meantime is better documented. The Amarna letters, those clay tablets from the diplomatic archive, include dozens of urgent communications from Egyptian-held territories in Canaan and Syria. Local governors writing to the pharaoh, requesting soldiers, requesting grain, describing raids by groups. The letters call the Habiru, describing city-states switching allegiances, describing the slow unraveling of the imperial network that Egyptian military campaigns had spent a century building. The letters went largely unanswered or were answered with token resources and instructions to hold on. Akhenaten was at Akhetaten, performing the rituals of the Aten, maintaining the cosmic order as he understood it to function, which meant, in the worldview he had constructed, that he was fulfilling his primary obligation. The empire's borders were a secondary concern to a man who believed that the primary work of kingship was standing in sunlight and conducting divine energy into the physical world. The governor's letters become more desperate across the period. Some of them read, even at 3,000 years distance, with a quality that is difficult to describe as anything other than abandonment. And through all of it, the army maintained some operational capacity. Egypt did not simply stop functioning militarily during the Amarna period. There is evidence of continued activity in Nubia, continued presence in parts of the Levant. But the strategic coherence that had characterized Egyptian foreign policy under Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, the systematic projection of military force in service of clearly defined imperial objectives, had dissolved. What remained was a defense function operating without clear central direction, maintained by career officers who knew their jobs and kept doing them because the alternative was chaos. Men like Horemheb. Around 1336 BCE. The dates of this period are approximate, subject to ongoing scholarly debate about the lengths of individual reigns. Akhenaten disappears from the record. No dramatic death inscription, no enemy claims credit. He was probably in his mid to late 30s. A mummy found in the tomb designated KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, badly damaged and controversial in its attribution. Scholars have argued about it for over a century, and the argument has not resolved cleanly. May be his, or maybe someone close to him. The physical evidence from the bones suggests a man who died relatively young. The cause is unknown. What followed was one of the most genuinely uncertain periods in the entire chronology of ancient Egypt. Smenkhkare, a name that appears in some inscriptions, possibly a co-regent, possibly a separate individual, possibly Nefertiti herself ruling under a changed titulary as Neferneferuaten, reigned for a period that scholars estimate at somewhere between 1 and 3 years. The evidence is fragmentary enough that serious Egyptologists hold fundamentally incompatible positions about who this figure was, whether they were male or female, and how exactly the succession from Akhenaten to the next clearly attested pharaoh actually unfolded. This is the kind of gap that draws people into Egyptology and then keeps them there for 30 years. But Horemheb was watching from somewhere outside this confusion. And when the chaos finally resolved into a single name, a child's name, a new throne name, Tutankhamun, he was ready to step into it. Not onto the throne, not yet, into the space just beneath it. He was probably 8 years old. That is the working estimate most scholars settle on for Tutankhamun's age at accession, somewhere between 8 and 10, old enough to be dressed in the double crown and seated on the throne, young enough that someone else's hands were guiding every decision that mattered. His birth name had been Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, a name given to him inside the theological world his father had built. The change to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, was not his idea. He was a child. The men around him had ideas. He was the surface on which those ideas were written. His parentage is established well enough by DNA analysis conducted on his mummy and the mummies found nearby. He was almost certainly a son of Akhenaten, probably by a secondary wife rather than by Nefertiti, which placed him in the awkward position of carrying the blood of the revolution he was being used to repudiate. The court that managed him, and managed is the right word, even if no inscription would have used it, was composed of 2 men whose interests converged in the short term and competed in the long. I and Horemheb. I was old. He had been a senior official since the reign of Amenhotep III, long enough that his exact origins and the precise nature of his connection to the royal family have generated decades of scholarly argument without resolution. His title, God's Father, is a designation that appears across Egyptian history in contexts ranging from the literal to the honorific, and what it meant specifically in his case is still genuinely disputed. He may have been Nefertiti's father. He may have been a brother of Queen T. What is clear is that he was close enough to the center of power across multiple reigns to have survived each transition, which required either extraordinary political skill or extraordinary invisibility, or, most probably, both. He was the kind of official who understood that survival in a court organized around a living god required knowing when to speak, when to agree, and when to be somewhere else entirely. Horemheb, by contrast, was visible, aggressively visible, and the monument that makes this most explicit is not in the Valley of the Kings. It is at Saqqara, the great necropolis of Memphis, on the edge of the desert plateau above the old capital, where Horemheb, still a general, still a subject, built himself a tomb. The Saqqara tomb was rediscovered in the modern era in pieces. Some of its carved reliefs had been removed in the 19th century and ended up in European museums, the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands, the British Museum in London, before anyone understood what they were from or where they belonged. The tomb itself was formally excavated beginning in 1975 by a joint British-Dutch mission that spent years uncovering what Horemheb had commissioned before he ever held a crown. What they found was not the modest resting place of a successful military officer. It was a monument of royal proportions, carved with the precision and ambition of a man who had decided, well in advance, what he intended his legacy to look like. The reliefs show Horemheb receiving gold collars from the pharaoh, the gold of honor, a reward for outstanding service that Egyptian art renders as a public ceremony. The king leaning forward from a window or balcony, draping the collars around the neck of the recipient below. It was the highest visible mark of royal favor a non-royal person could receive, and Horemheb chose to have it carved into his own tomb walls, not into the palace record. His tomb, the monument he controlled, the one whose content no subsequent official could edit without breaking stone. Foreign prisoners are shown being presented to him, Nubians, Syrians, men from the regions of the Levant that Egyptian campaigns had spent decades subduing. He is depicted in his administrative roles, overseeing, directing, receiving reports. The imagery is not subtle about the scope of what he controlled. His titles in this period include Overseer of all the king's works, Deputy of the king in the entire land, Overseer of overseers of scribes of the king, and Great Commander of the army. Running them together like that makes them sound like bureaucratic decoration. They were not. Each title represented actual administrative authority over a distinct sector of the Egyptian state. Taken together, they describe a man who held effective control over the military, the civil administration, and the royal building program simultaneously, while the king on the throne was a child who had not yet learned to shave. I've looked at the relief fragments from this tomb many times, in photographs and in person. There is a quality in the way Horemheb is rendered, the scale of the figures, the deliberateness of every compositional choice, that I keep coming back to without quite being able to name cleanly. It's not arrogance, exactly. Or not only arrogance, it reads more like preparation, like a man who understood that stone would last longer than any political arrangement and who was investing accordingly. But it is the restoration stela that most clearly captures what was actually happening in the early years of Tutankhamun's reign, who held the pen and whose name was being placed on which documents. The stela, probably erected at Karnak, its exact original location debated, announces the restoration of the traditional religious order. The Aten shrines are closed. The temples of Amun and the other traditional gods are reopened. Their estates and revenues are restored. The king, the text declares, found the temples fallen into ruin, their sanctuaries overgrown, their gods having abandoned Egypt, a passage that reads, in its framing, as if the desolation had arrived from nowhere, like a weather event, rather than as the direct consequence of a deliberate policy carried out by the previous ruler. The cause is not named. The man who had ordered the temples closed, who had declared the traditional gods obsolete and seized their wealth, is described only by implication, as an absence, a gap, a period during which things were simply wrong. Tutankhamun's cartouche is on the stela. He did not write it. He was 9 or 10 years old. The men who wrote it understood exactly what they were doing with language, how to use the architecture of official Egyptian prose to describe a catastrophe without naming the catastrophe's author, to declare a restoration without conceding what had been lost, to position a child king as the divine agent of correction without explaining why correction was needed. And Horemheb was one of those men. The stela would later be re-inscribed, Tutankhamun's cartouche replaced by Horemheb's own, incorporating him retroactively into the restoration narrative. But that came later. In this moment, the document served its immediate purpose. It marked the official end of the Amarna period, aligned the crown with the priesthood of Amun, and began the long work of pretending that what had just happened had not, in fact, happened. Meanwhile, at Saqqara, the tomb walls continued to be carved. 2 parallel projects, one official, one personal. A child king whose name was on the documents and a general whose face was on the walls. Both, in their way, building something meant to outlast the present arrangement. The difference was that the general knew he was building. The child, it is hard to imagine, understood what he was inside. There is a particular set of objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Small wooden figures, gilded, showing the young king standing on the prow of a reed boat, poised as if in the act of throwing a harpoon. That archaeologists classify as ritual objects associated with the hunt and the symbolic defeat of chaos. They are extraordinarily beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. And looking at them, what strikes me is not their beauty, but their smallness. The scale of the figure on each one, a boy's proportions rendered in gold, dressed in a king's regalia, performing a king's ritual in an object small enough to hold in one hand. That was what Tutankhamun was. A boy performing a king's ritual. In a world built by men who had decided very carefully what the ritual would mean. The tomb was not ready. That is the first thing to understand about Tutankhamun's death. Not the cause, not the circumstances, not the theories that have accumulated around his mummy like sediment over a century of examination. The first thing to understand is the haste. The burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings that received his body was small. Too small for a king, more suited to the scale of a noble's tomb, repurposed at speed because the proper royal tomb either hadn't been started or hadn't been finished. The outermost gilded shrine enclosing his coffins did not quite fit the chamber. There was a gap between the shrine's surface and the wall behind it, a few centimeters of miscalculation that no craftsman would have allowed if there had been time to correct it. The paintings on the north wall, the most important wall in the chamber, the one showing the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual through which the dead king would regain his senses, were applied so quickly that the plaster was not fully dry when the tomb was sealed. The chemistry of rapid application is still visible in the surface today. He was 18, possibly 19. The bone analysis puts him in that range, and the physical evidence from the mummy tells a complicated story. A broken leg, a fracture in the left femur that occurred shortly before death, possibly still healing when he died. Malaria parasites detected in his tissue samples. A skull showing characteristics that have generated a long unresolved argument about whether they indicate genetic stress from generations of close-kin marriage, a deliberate blow, or simply the post-mortem damage that accumulates in a body that has been moved and handled many times across 3,000 years. The honest answer is that we do not know what killed him, and the confident pronouncements that emerge periodically from press releases, chariot accident, murder, infected leg, multiple organ failure, exceed what the evidence actually supports. A young man died. The exact reason remains in the category of things the archive has not decided to tell us. He left no male heir. His wife, Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a woman who had spent her entire life inside the most unusual court in Egyptian history, was now a widow in a palace where two older men were already calculating what her position was worth to them. She had been born into the Amana world. She had been photographed in a sense, rendered in relief, depicted as a small girl sitting on her mother's lap while her father leaned forward to receive the rays of the Aten, before she was old enough to understand what any of it meant. She had watched the revolution happen around her, had watched its dismantling, had been married to a boy king and used alongside him as the face of the restoration. She understood her function in the machinery she lived inside. And when her husband's body was still cooling, she made a decision that was either the most courageous act recorded from any woman of the New Kingdom period or the most desperate, or both simultaneously. She wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, was Egypt's most powerful rival and occasional enemy, the state that would eventually produce, at Kadesh, the most famous battle of the ancient world, fought to a draw against Ramesses II. Suppiluliuma I, the Hittite king who received the letter, was one of the great military commanders of the 14th century BCE. He and Akhenaten had corresponded. The diplomatic relationship was wary, carefully managed, never warm. The Hittites and Egyptians were imperial neighbors who understood each other's capacity for harm. The letter, preserved in the Hittite archive at their capital Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, discovered and translated in the early 20th century CE, says, in essence, "My husband has died. I have no son. I am told you have many sons. Send one of them to me to become my husband. I will not take one of my own servants and make him my husband." That phrase, "one of my own servants," it sounds, on first reading, like a reference to palace staff, the kind of language a queen might use to describe household functionaries she considers beneath her. It is not. The word she was using to describe the men she refused to marry, men she called servants, even as they commanded the largest military force in the known world and administered an empire stretching from the Euphrates to Sudan, was calculated, specific, and furious. Whether she meant I or Horemheb, or both of them at once, she was making explicit what court protocol existed to keep silent. She knew what was coming, she named it, and she would rather invite Egypt's most formidable enemy into the palace than accept it. Suppiluliuma was suspicious. An approach like this, a queen writing secretly to a foreign king, offering a marriage alliance that would place a Hittite prince on the Egyptian throne, was not a standard diplomatic communication. It was either a genuine crisis or a trap. He sent an envoy to Egypt to verify that the letter was real and that Ankhesenamun had actually sent it. She wrote again. The second letter is the one I keep returning to, because there is something in the act of writing twice, knowing that the first letter had already been sent, that the court around her was certainly aware of or actively monitoring her communications, that the envoy's arrival and departure would not have gone unnoticed. That speaks to a particular quality of calculation under pressure. She was not reckless. Reckless people do not write two letters to the Hittite king. She understood exactly what she was doing and had decided clearly that the alternative was worse. What that tells us about what she expected to happen next, what she already knew was being arranged around her, I don't think requires extensive interpretation. Suppiluliuma sent a prince. His name was Zananza. Zananza was killed somewhere between Hattusa and Egypt. The Hittite records are explicit. He was killed by Egyptians. The Egyptian records are silent. No name is attached to the order. No inscription commemorates the interception. It is one of those events that the official archive has chosen to process as something that simply did not happen, which is itself the most informative possible response. After that, Ankhesenamun disappears from the record entirely. A pair of ring basils found in the modern era carries her cartouche alongside eyes, suggesting, though not proving, a marriage between them. If it happened, it was the political marriage she had written 2 letters to a foreign king to avoid. Her name does not appear in any surviving source after that point. She was probably in her early 20s, and so I became pharaoh. The mechanism was theological, which in the Egyptian understanding of how succession worked was not a lesser category than the political. It was the same thing. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed at the burial of a king, was understood in their belief system as the ritual that restored the dead person's capacity to exist, to breathe, to eat, to speak, to move through the afterlife. It was ideally performed by the heir. The son did it for the father. By performing it for Tutankhamun, I was not making a claim in the conventional political sense. He was making it in the most sacred register available, inscribed on the north wall of the burial chamber, painted while the body was still present in the room, depicting him in the blue war crown with the ritual instruments in his hands, doing what only a successor had the authority to do. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic theology. And Horemheb, who commanded the army, who administered the civil apparatus, who had spent a decade accumulating exactly the kind of power that should have made him the natural successor, could not simply undo it. You cannot unperform a burial ritual. You cannot retroactively change who was in the room when the king's senses were restored to him in the next world. The ceremony had happened. It had been painted. The theological logic was complete. What Horemheb did instead was nothing. Not passivity, not defeat. Something more deliberate than either of those. He did not contest Ai's accession. He did not withdraw from court or signal opposition through the channels available to powerful officials who wished to register their displeasure without committing to open confrontation. He served. He continued administering. He continued commanding. He waited with the patience of a man who understood that I was old, that I had no male heir, and that the loyalty of the military, built across 2 decades of shared hardship, shared campaigns, shared administrative work, would not transfer to an elderly courtier simply because an elderly courtier was wearing a crown. The army knew who it worked for. I reigned approximately 4 years. He began a tomb in the West Valley of the Kings, a smaller branch of the necropolis, sometimes called the Valley of the Monkeys, where Amenhotep III had also been buried. He did not finish it. He left behind no major building program, no significant military campaigns, no administrative innovation that the sources chose to preserve. He was a pharaoh who reigned in the space between 2 more significant powers, useful for a moment, then gone. When he died, Horemheb stepped forward, and the first thing he did, before any law was written or any temple restored or any campaign planned, was begin the careful, systematic work of making sure that no one who came after would know that any of the previous 4 kings had ever existed. The first thing Horemheb needed was not power. He already had that. What he needed was a story. No royal blood ran through him. No divine genealogy could be traced back through his family line to any previous king, no matter how creatively the palace scribes might have tried. The system he had spent his entire adult life serving was a system whose most fundamental legitimating claim, that the pharaoh was the son of the gods, the living embodiment of Horus, the hinge between the human and divine orders, did not apply to him in any of its conventional forms. Other non-royal pharaohs had navigated this problem before him. The solution was always the same in its basic structure, though the details varied. You did not argue against the theology. You absorbed it. You presented your accession not as a break in the divine order, but as its fulfillment, a man chosen by the gods through channels that bypassed the usual biological inheritance, because the gods, being gods, were not bound by biology. At Karnak, an inscription was composed describing a festival procession in which the sacred bark of Amun, the ceremonial boat that carried the god's image through the temple complex during public festivals, paused before Horemheb, stopped in the understanding of those present by divine will. singled him out from the assembled officials and presented him before witnesses as the god's chosen successor. This was the standard formula for divine selection. It had been used before. What made it more than a formula in this case was the institutional weight behind it. The priesthood of Amun, the same institution whose temples had been closed, whose estates had been seized, whose entire professional existence had been dismantled by Akhenaten and only partially reconstructed under Tutankhamun, was placing its full authority behind Horemheb's claim. He had been the man administering their restoration for years. He had managed their return to power on behalf of a child king and then an old courtier. Now they were returning the favor in the most public, most theologically charged way available to them. The arrangement was, in a word, complete. The priesthood got a king who owed them his legitimacy. The king got a theological narrative that transformed his lack of royal blood from a liability into a sign of divine preference. The system closed around them both. He married his wife Mutnojmet, depicted in the reliefs of the Memphite tomb and identified by many scholars, though the attribution is contested, as a sister of Nefertiti, to the rank of great royal wife, giving him a genealogical thread, however thin, connecting him to the Amarna bloodline he was simultaneously erasing. Then he commissioned a biographical account of his own life, a public inscription presenting his decades of military and administrative service not as the career of a loyal subject, but as a divinely guided preparation for kingship, a trajectory that had always been intended, that had always been moving toward this point. The text does not describe a general who waited. It describes a king who had been in formation. And then he did the thing. The biography was designed to frame as natural. He declared that his reign had begun not in the approximate year of A's death, around 1319 BCE, but in approximately 1340 BCE, immediately following the death of Amenhotep III. The 21 years between those two dates, the years of Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, or Neferneferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I, were administratively removed from the chronology of Egyptian kingship. Removed is the precise word here, or rather, and I want to get this right, because removed implies a single act, and what actually happened was more like a sustained institutional decision. Those years were declared to have belonged to his reign. His regnal year count incorporated them. The king lists compiled under later pharaohs, including the Turin king list and the lists carved at Abydos under Seti I and Rameses II, record no pharaoh between Amenhotep III and Horemheb. 21 years. Blank. The legal reform came next. A long inscription on a stele at Karnak, Horemheb's great edict, addresses a series of documented abuses across the Egyptian administrative system. Corrupt officials collecting unauthorized taxes, soldiers stealing from civilians, taking their boats, seizing their labor, false assessments levied against farmers, the extortion of ferry operators and fishermen by officials who treated the river as their personal toll road. The edict is specific, detailed, and in places surprisingly direct about the mechanisms of extraction that lower officials had apparently been running for years. It establishes penalties. It creates accountability structures. It reads in sections like a genuine administrative reform document produced by someone who had spent decades watching a bureaucracy malfunction and had been cataloging the failures. What the edict never says is why the system was in this condition. The abuses it describes did not arise from nothing. They arose from a generation of institutional disruption, the dissolution and reconstitution of administrative hierarchies, the period during which the Egyptian state had been reorganized around a theology that most of its officials did not share and many had privately opposed. But the edict describes a state of disorder without origin, abuses requiring correction by a just king. The correction appears, the cause does not. The gap between Amenhotep III and Horemheb is not a gap in the edict's logic. It does not exist. The narrative of the reign had been constructed. Now came the physical work. The erasure of Akhenaten posed the largest practical challenge simply because he had built so much. His construction program at Karnak, the Aten temples he had raised on the eastern side of the complex during the early years of his reign, before moving the capital to Amarna, had used a distinctive building technology: small sandstone relief blocks, roughly the size that a single worker could carry, approximately 26 centimeters tall by 52 centimeters long. The French term used for these blocks today is talatat, a word borrowed through Arabic, though its ultimate etymology is disputed. Tens of thousands of them had been used to construct the Aten temples. They were covered in painted reliefs, figures making offerings, the royal family bathing in solar light, the physical rituals of the new theology recorded in stone in extraordinary detail. Horemheb dismantled the temples and used the blocks as fill material, specifically as packing material inside the pylons, the massive gateway towers he was constructing at Karnak. The 2nd, 9th and 10th pylons at Karnak are built around cores of rubble that turn out, on examination, to be tens of thousands of Amarna period relief blocks, stacked face inward, sealed inside the pylons and covered with fresh limestone casing. The images were not destroyed, they were buried, packed inside the very structures intended to demonstrate Horemheb's own building program, preserved by the weight of the stone above them with an accidental thoroughness that no deliberate archiving effort could have matched. When modern archaeologists began opening and X-raying the Karnak pylons in the 20th century, they found them. Thousands of blocks, still painted, still sharp. Digital reconstruction projects are now attempting to reassemble the original temple walls from the scattered fragments, like solving a puzzle where the pieces have been deliberately shuffled and then accidentally frozen in position for 3,000 years. The act of erasure had created an archive. The demolition was the preservation. The treatment of Tutankhamun was more surgical. His restoration stela, the monument declaring the return of the traditional religious order, the document whose language had been so carefully crafted to describe a desolation without naming its cause, was reinscribed with Horemheb's cartouche. The child king's name came off, the generals went on. He was now, officially, the pharaoh who had restored the temples. Later inscriptions that referenced Tutankhamun's building work or ceremonial activity were similarly adjusted, his name replaced by Horemheb's, occasionally by eyes, occasionally by both in sequence, as if multiple rounds of revision had passed over the same surface. The restoration stela that had been used to manage the aftermath of Akhenaten's reign was now being used again, performing a second erasure inside the first, a political document overwriting itself as the men who controlled the pen changed hands. But this is the thing about Horemheb's erasure program that I find myself returning to after years with these sources. It was thorough in exactly the places where it could be thorough, and it was helpless in the places where it could not reach. The tomb of Tutankhamun had been entered in antiquity, twice by the evidence. Two separate ancient break-ins, both apparently caught or interrupted, the tomb resealed by officials who then either forgot about it or whose records were themselves lost. Construction debris from later royal tombs in the valley gradually covered the entrance. By the time Horemheb's workmen were reinscribing stelae and hammering cartouches from temple walls, the tomb was already invisible. Whether anyone knew it was there and chose to leave it alone, or whether it had already been forgotten, and the evidence tilts toward the latter, the result was the same. The burial chamber was not touched. When Howard Carter found it in November 1922, he found Tutankhamun's name on thousands of objects. The gilded wooden figures of the king standing at the prow of a reed boat, poised to throw a harpoon, dressed in the regalia of a pharaoh, performing a ritual older than the New Kingdom. The nested coffins, the golden mask, the jewelry, the food offerings still sealed in their containers after 33 centuries. The ceremonial chariots, the beds, the small ivory headrest carved in the shape of Shu, the god of air, kneeling with his arms raised to support the sky, and in the belief system of those who placed it there, supporting the head of the sleeping king. Every object in that room bore a name that had been systematically removed from every accessible public surface in Egypt. The completeness of the tomb's survival is in direct proportion to the completeness of the erasure above it. The more thoroughly Horemheb removed Tutankhamun from the public record, the more the sealed room underground became the only place the name existed. And because it was the only place, and because it was sealed, it lasted. And Ankhesenamun's letter, the evidence that a young queen had understood exactly what was coming and had tried, twice, with extraordinary clarity and at considerable personal risk to stop it, was not in Egypt when Horemheb began his work. It was in an archive in Hattusa, in Anatolia, in the capital of the empire whose prince she had tried to import. It would remain there for over 3,000 years in a city that was itself eventually abandoned and buried until a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler excavated the site between 1906 and 1912 and found, among the thousands of clay tablets in the Hittite Royal Archive, a letter from a queen who had run out of options. History occasionally places evidence in the one location the interested party cannot reach. The stone remembers what the system wanted to forget. Horemheb reigned approximately 27 years. He built extensively at Karnak and Luxor. He designated a successor, his vizier Parames, who became Ramesses I, and in doing so founded the lineage that would produce Seti I and, eventually, Ramesses II, the pharaoh who would reign for 66 years and cover every available surface in Egypt with his own name. The dynasty Horemheb created was one of the most durable in Egyptian history. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, in a tomb, Kheaves 57, that was larger and more elaborately decorated than the one he had prepared for himself at Saqqara, but which was also unfinished at his death, its corridors not quite complete, its final chambers still bearing the gridded guidelines that Egyptian draftsmen drew on plaster before beginning to carve. He had outlasted everyone. He had reorganized the record. He had written himself into a position where the official history of Egypt skipped over 2 decades to arrive at him, as if the interval between Amenhotep III and Horemheb had simply been a held breath. The 4 men he erased are the ones we know. Their names survive in the objects sealed underground, in the archives of their enemies, in the rubble packed inside his own pylons. He is the pharaoh who built his legacy on their absence, and their absence is what brought people back to them. That's the part he couldn't have anticipated. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. I'm always curious how far these buried stories travel.